Shalom, welcome back. We're continuing this study into getting to the heart of the matter of the religion delivered by Moses, the Sinai covenant. And the tool we're currently using to delve into that is Ancient Israel's Faith and History. It's a book by George Mendenhall. And we've been working our way through it. We're up to chapter 3 now, which is on the 12-tribe federation. So we started out looking at the way that religions will develop. We talked about the prologue to this particular religion, and when we spoke about what the situation was like in Palestine and the ancient Near East prior to the Sinai covenant. Then we went through the formative period, which is at Sinai, and immediately thereafter under the leadership of Moses, and then now we're up to the adaptive period. And Professor Mendenhall has actually identified two adaptive periods. The first one is during the time that corresponds with the book of Judges, when the 12 tribes were basically ruling themselves, that there were certain changes that the Sinai covenant went through as history was reimagined, and certain scribes would insert statements into Moses' mouth, or maybe they would add some various commandments that were not original to the Sinai covenant. And so the first of those adaptive periods was during the book of Judges. The second adaptive period would have been during the reign of Solomon and his successors, and that's when things really started to change a lot, because now the powers that be, being the king and his administration, they had a self-serving interest to give themselves legitimacy, and they used the Sinai covenant to do so, as well as creating a new covenant in which David's descendants are given the authority to reign. And so we're looking at some of these changes, and part of the purpose is because we want to remove those additions. We don't want to be following the commandments of men. We don't want to be following these commands that were put in for political purposes, and we want to get back to the original covenant, because if we can get back to that, then we've uncovered the justice of Yah. We've uncovered what it is exactly that Yahweh wants from us. So, before we get into this, I do want to mention the previous videos were really about laying a foundation to some of the things we're going to talk about. So, if you haven't seen those videos, you may want to go into the playlist of Seeking Yahweh's Justice and watch some of those earlier videos. But really, the introduction and the first two chapters of Professor Mendenhall's book really lays the foundation. So when I was putting those presentations together, I used a lot of the information. And now that we're into these later chapters about the adaptive periods and such, I'm not going to use as much information from the book. So if you want that information, you really just need to get a copy of the book, and there's a link in the description where you can download it for free, or you could always purchase a print edition from Amazon. But because I'm going to be skipping through the information for brevity's sake, if you want the full picture, the full explanation of some of the things that Professor Mendenhall says, get the book and read it. It's a pretty easy read. It's not hard to understand by any means. So he starts off by saying this 12-tribe federation existed during a dark age that archaeologists label the Iron Age 1 AB period, roughly 1290 to 1000 BC. If it arose simultaneously to the Philistine Confederation along the coast, and if it being the Federation, began to collapse after the Israelite defeat at the Battle of Ebenezer, then we might date the Federation more precisely to 1175 to 1025 BC. After this, it was transformed into a political state ruled by a king. During this period, authority within this federation resided ultimately in the religious tradition of Sinai, so much so that the Israelites themselves regarded Yahweh, the God of Sinai, as their functional equivalent to a king. Consequently, in many important respects, early Israel was the domain of Yahweh, or kingdom of God. In other words, this federation appears to have been a community whose morale and cohesion, to the extent such existed, was provided solely by a religious ethic regarded as a royal policy of Yahweh. And so this was, I would say this is probably what Yeshua was seeking to restore during his ministry. He spoke often about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. And so the kingdom of God would have been this period where the Israelites were being ruled by Yahweh as their functional king. And that's essentially what the ideal was that Yeshua was promoting, that this kingdom of Yahweh is there waiting for us to really take hold of. And the way we do that is by submitting ourselves to his rule. Anthropologists correctly understand that tribes are fragile social bodies compared to states, composed of economically self-sufficient residential units. They are usually geographically based networks of villages providing effective economic and military counterweights to the demands of urban power centers. Their fragile unity is often bolstered symbolically by the claim that everyone in the tribe descends from a common ancestor. In fact, actual blood kinship hardly ever exists. So what Professor Mendenhall is saying is that typically, when you see these like tribal networks, there is a tradition that they all descend from a common ancestor, but that's not usually literally the case. It's more of a like a type of like origin myth type of thing, where you this belief is used to kind of bind people together as a extended family. And I think that even in modern history, we tend to do something similar. So like here in America, we talk a lot about the founding fathers, about these men that established this nation. And even though we're not blood related to them, typically, this whole like mythos of the founding fathers, and that they established this country for their posterity, and that's the kind of used to bind us together into this patriotic type of understanding with one another. And I thought that that was interesting, that Professor Mendenhall is questioning whether there were literally 12 sons of Jacob, and each son of Jacob was a tribe. What Professor Mendenhall believes, and what I kind of tend to agree with him. I think that I haven't really thought about this much before, but he makes some good points about this. And the interesting thing to me is that it lines up with something that Peter says. Like, Peter seems to question this whole origin story of Jacob. Did he really have these 4 wives and these 12 sons or not? And Peter himself says that he doesn't really believe that was the case. In the Sermons of Peter, Book 2, Chapter 52, Peter answered and said, "Assuredly, with good reason, neither I believe anything against God, nor against the just man recorded in the law, taking for granted that they are impious imaginations. For as I am persuaded, neither was Adam a transgressor who was fashioned by the hands of Yahweh, nor was Noah drunken, who was found righteous above all the world, nor did Abraham live with 3 women at once, who on account of his sobriety was thought worthy of a numerous posterity, nor did Jacob associate with 4, of whom 2 were sisters, who was the father of 12 tribes, and who intimated the coming of the presence of our Master. Nor was Moses a murderer, nor did he learn to judge from an idolatrous priest, he who set forth the law of Yahweh to all the world. And for his right judgment has been testified to as a faithful steward." So, Peter himself seems to question some of these early stories of these patriarchs of the faith. What was it then that made it possible for these different hill country tribes, clans, and other subgroups to coexist with some degree of peace and security during this period? It is much easier to say what it was not. First, it could not have been blood kinship. The so-called Shibboleth incident in Judges 12 describes how Transjordan Yahwist demanded the Palestinian Yahwist pronounce the password Shibboleth, knowing that it contained a type of SH sound they could not pronounce. This provides graphic evidence that even though they all spoke the same West Semitic language as non-Israelites, they did not all speak the same dialect. This would be unlikely if they were biologically related to each other. Nor could their confederation have been based on a common ethnic heritage. Proper names suggest that the Israelite forebears came from diverse ethnic backgrounds, just as one would expect, given the ethnic melting pot that existed at the time and place. So some of the names, both place names and the names of individuals, would show being actually Amorite names or Hittite names, or or some of the leaders would have similar names as these other ethnic groups. So the point is that they obviously there was some diversity. They were not all blood descendants. Consequently, the basis of Israelite unity could not have been common cultural practices. For example, the tradition about Zelofehad clans in Numbers 27, where a daughter could inherit property in the absence of sons, is radically different from the custom of Levirate marriage preferred by some other Israelites, under which, if a deceased man left no sons, his brother would sire sons on his behalf so that property would not be inherited by daughters. Here is a significant difference in customs among the Israelites involving an issue basic to the solidarity of the family. So the fact that you had these conflicting laws in certain tribes would tell you that they were not all descended from the same group of people. We must take seriously the possibility that the so-called 12 tribes of Israel were held together only by ideology, that is, a shared but fragile vision or hope in the absence of other factors. This may well have been the intangible polity conferring predictability to the corporate affairs of these diverse people. Being intangible, it has left virtually no trace in the archaeological record. The later author of the book of Judges, in his own characteristic way, agreed that the health and viability of the early federation had indeed been linked to its members' commitment to this intangible religious factor. When different values became paramount, in other words, people began worshiping other gods, social fissioning resulted and the community became vulnerable to exploitation. What these 12 tribes shared was their voluntary acceptance of a covenant of obedience to a divine king, namely Yahweh. In the absence of political mechanisms of social control, they embraced a religious mechanism. They considered the Yahwist ethic expressed in the commitments of the Sinai covenant to be paramount. While the imprecision of these ethical principles rendered them useless as legal statutes, they nevertheless defined principles of personal integrity, enabling people of different tribal and ethnic backgrounds to consider as brothers anyone who likewise shared a commitment to the paramount nature of these principles. So in other words, the Ten Commandments were not written about specific types of sin. So like where it says, do not commit adultery, adultery is a very vague term. It covers a lot of type of behaviors. So it wasn't a specific type of adultery, it was any adultery. It wasn't a specific type of theft, it was any theft. It wasn't a particular type of killing, it was any killing that these commandments rejected, that they spoke against this type of behavior. And so because of that, they shouldn't be viewed as legal statutes because they're very broad, but rather as principles or precepts. In fact, in the Nazarene Acts I was reading the other day, and it described the Ten Commandments as precepts. And a precept, if you look it up, a precept is like a principle. It's like a guiding principle that you would use. So even the Nazarene Acts kind of seems to go along with what Professor Mendenhall was saying about them being more like a principle to follow, not a specific statute. So if Yahweh says thou shalt not commit adultery, he's speaking about any form of adultery. If he says thou shalt not kill, he's speaking against any form of killing, which would not necessarily include, like, any type of killing as an individual. But then but Professor Mendenhall also states that wouldn't necessarily mean as a community, if someone does something like murder and you're going to put them to death, that commandment wouldn't necessarily apply to that. It wouldn't apply to the exercise of a judicial proceeding, but the exercise of individuals making those type of decisions. At the same time, this also enabled members of the different tribes, clans, and subgroups to interact with one another while retaining those aspects of their respective culture, such as inheritance practices that did not conflict with or supersede their shared Yahweh's commitments. This was not unlike what happened in early Christianity as well, which cut across the tremendous cultural diversity of the first century Mediterranean world and permitted Christians to retain any aspect of their own indigenous cultures that did not clash with Christian faith and life. And I think that's a good point that he's making. Like, maybe we can look at the way that Christianity spread and kind of understand that there was probably a similar process that the Mosaic faith went through also, where as Christianity spread, it wasn't spread to just one ethnic group of people. It was spread across many different types of cultures. And why would we think any different about the faith that was taught by Moses? These ethical commitments were made compelling not by social forces, but by a spiritual one that the Bible calls the fear of Yahweh, what we call conscience. This spiritual force was linked with historical processes. It was not a matter of people's souls being supernaturally cleansed of all self-interest. Not even the Bible makes that claim. Rather, the historical context made the embrace of this new religious structure an extremely attractive and therefore a somewhat reasonable and natural choice to make. At the opportune moment, community was, in fact, attained across the hill country of Palestine and Transjordan when enough people became committed to this ethic, trusting each other to act consciously as the fundamental areas of life associated with the obligations of the Sinai covenant. Sworn to by the individual and integrated into the fabric of social life, this religious ethic made it possible for the Israelite Federation of Tribes to exist for almost 2 centuries without resort to or reliance on any organized monopoly of coercive force. A covenant is a binding promise, voluntarily made. The Yahweh's covenant was not a mere social contract in which people made promises to one another, thereby essentially helping guarantee each other's legitimate interest. Instead, each person was bound individually to Yahweh. In other words, to something intangible, to a value system that transcends material self-interest. Thus, it was that a community was created. The vital question then becomes, how much do these Israelites fear Yahweh? If the religious commitment to this ethic wanes, relationships deteriorate and community begins to disintegrate, eventually resulting in tension, conflict, anarchy, and chaos. In biblical terms, future generations would suffer as a result of improper choices made in the present. This is also the key to the later Israelite fascination with history. They saw clear cause and effect links between their religious ethic and the normal processes of continuity and change that human beings experience. So we're about to get into examining this story of this conquest of Palestine in the book of Judges. But before we go there, I want to kind of take a little aside here for a moment and refer to the sermons of Peter and what he has to say about Yahweh's character and about believing everything that's in the Bible, even the things that are written against Yahweh. And he cautions us not to believe everything. If something paints Yahweh in a negative light, Peter says we should doubt that that's factual. And so starting in the Sermons of Peter, Book 2, chapter 42, Peter says, "But what I am going to tell you will be sufficient by way of example. But I do not think, my dear Clement, that anyone who possesses ever so little love to Yahweh and ingenuousness will be able to take in or even hear the things that are spoken against him. For how is it that he can have a monarchic soul and be holy, who supposes there are many gods and not one only? But even if there be but one, who will cherish a zeal to be holy that finds him in many defects, since he will hope in the beginning of all things, by reason of the defects of his own nature, will not visit the crimes of another? Wherefore, far be it from us to believe that the Master of all, who made the heaven and the earth and all things that are in them, shares his government with others, or that he lies. For if he lies, then who speaks truth? Or if he makes experiments as in ignorance, who then foreknows? And if he deliberates and changes his purpose, who is perfect in understanding and permanent in design? If he envies, who is above rivalry? If he hardens hearts, who makes wise? If he makes blind and deaf, who has given sight and hearing? If he commits pilfering, who administers justice? If he mocks, who is sincere? If he is weak, who is omnipotent? If he is unjust, who is just? If he makes evil things, who shall make good things? If he does evil, who shall do good? But if he desires the fruitful hill, whose then are all things? If he is false, who then is true? If he dwells in a tabernacle, who is without bounds? If he is fond of fat and sacrifices and offerings and drink offerings, who then is without need? And who is holy and pure and perfect? If he is pleased with candles and candlesticks, who then placed the luminaries in the heaven? If he dwells in shadow and darkness and storm and smoke, who is the light that lightens the universe? If he comes with trumpets and shoutings and darts and arrows, who then is the looked-for tranquility of all? If he loves war, who then wishes peace? If he makes evil things, who makes good things? If he is without affection, who is a lover of man? If he is not faithful to his promises, who shall be trusted? If he loves the wicked and adulterers and murderers, who shall be a just judge? If he changes his mind, who is steadfast? If he chooses evil men, who then takes the part of the good? One of the criticisms that people will level against Yahweh is this story in the Bible where Joshua was leading the Israelites into the Promised Land, and various tribes and communities of people are genocided. There's stories in the book of Deuteronomy, where in the book of Numbers, where at times of war, entire communities are wiped out, or certain groups are told to be slaughtered. And I feel like that kind of fits in with some of the things that Peter says, specifically what's highlighted in yellow right now. If he loves war, if Yahweh loves war, then who wishes peace? If Yahweh loves wicked and adulterers and murderers, who is a just judge? So it should call into question whether Yahweh really demanded those things. Did he really demand that bloodshed? And I would tend to think he does not. That people tend to use Yahweh as an excuse or a motivation to do things that Yahweh would not want us to do. I can't imagine God at any time desires war, unless it's like a defensive war where you're defending your family from an aggressor. But a lot of these preemptive wars where, we think they're going to attack us, so let's attack them first, that's an immoral type of war. It's immoral to do that. Peter then goes on to say, "Wherefore, Clement, my son, Beware of thinking otherwise of Yahweh than that he is the only God and Master and Father, good and just, the Creator, long-suffering, merciful, the Sustainer, the Benefactor, ordaining love of man, counseling purity, immortal, and making immortal, incomparable, dwelling in the souls of the good, that cannot be contained, and yet is contained, who has fixed the great world as a center in space, who spread out the heavens and solidified the earth, who stored up the water, who has disposed the stars in the sky, who has made the fountains flow in the earth and produced faults, has raised up mountains, has set bounds to the sea, has ordered winds and blasts, who by the spirit of counsel has kept safely the body comprehended in a boundless sea. So, believing that Yahweh would demand a wholesale slaughter of people who were political enemies is not painting Yahweh in a positive light. So just based upon the things that Simon Peter says here in the second book of his sermons should cause you to question the truthfulness of some of these stories that we read about in the Torah and in the book of Joshua. The establishment of the 12-tribe federation in Canaan is usually equated with the so-called Hebrew conquest of Palestine, recounted in the much later stories of Joshua 1 through 11. An overwhelming number of biblical scholars today agree that these bloody stories are historically inaccurate. The linguistic and archaeological evidence, combined with re-examination of the biblical traditions themselves, today support an alternative historical reconstruction. Briefly, and therefore simplistically stated, it is possible to reconstruct the processes and sequence whereby a community of Yahweh worshippers appeared in Palestine as a two-stage development. So what Professor Mendenhall is saying here is not very far off from what Peter was just saying, that these stories of the bloody massacres as Israel came into the Promised Land are probably, should be, doubted. So here is a suggested historical, like an alternative scenario. And I find this to be an interesting scenario that Professor Mendenhall puts forth. Now what he's doing is he's taking the historical accounts we have, using some of that information to reconstruct what happened. And in the process, I think he does a pretty good job of explaining how this story of the 12 sons and the 12 tribes came about. As one tribe was added, the origin story was changed to add another tribe to it, or another son. And that's where these 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Israel, came from. So stage one was Sinai to Transjordan. After departing Mount Sinai, life in the Sinai desert could not have been easy for the several hundred ex-slaves and their meager livestock. They managed to eke out their livelihood in the wilderness through partly through miracles, like finding water at the right moment, not to mention the manna and the quails, and partially through a symbiotic relationship with the Midianite clan of Moses' father-in-law, a group apparently well adapted to wilderness living. While they may not have felt themselves destined for any promised land, the Bible does not really depict them as homeless wanderers. Their home for much of that time was in the well-watered site of Kadesh Barnea. In fact, a close reading of the wilderness narratives shows that the escaped slaves spent virtually all their wilderness years there. From Kadesh Barnea, they could take their flocks out into the steppes for seasonal grazing. The biblical tradition suggests that these pastoralists periodically attempted to negotiate grazing rights with various local political regimes that were patrolling portions of the steppe. At some point, some of these Yahwists brought their flocks and herds to the pasture lands of eastern Transjordan, where they were confronted by Sihon, a petty warlord operating out of Heshbon. Sihon and his gang of soldiers had probably recently migrated from the late Bronze Age kingdom of Amurru, which had collapsed along with everything else around 1200 BC. Sihon dispatched perhaps a half dozen of his professional warriors to attack and despoil these Yahwist shepherds. We often fail to appreciate what a small number of professionally armed soldiers were required to establish dominion over vast territories of defenseless villages. Sihon's troops failed in their mission, and their deaths so seriously undermined Sihon's ability to control the villages surrounding Heshbon that his kingdom there collapsed. According to the Bible, Sihon's territory was almost immediately occupied by the tribe of Reuben. But what happened to Sihon's former subjects? There is no hint in either the Bible or the archaeological record that the Yahwist shepherds had any grievances against these villagers, much less to put them to the sword or seize their houses and fields. A more plausible explanation is that the villages in this area, relieved to be rid of Sihon's regime, made a covenant or an agreement with the Yahwist shepherds that included recognizing Yahweh now as their God too. Again, if these villages had originally come to Transjordan as Aparu refugees with the frontier mentality, hoping to escape an intolerable social, political, and religious situation in their native lands, the prospect of a new God appearing as an alternate to the old political ones would have been quite attractive. The idea of a community based on a shared commitment to fundamental religious ethic rather than on centralized force must have seemed especially appealing. In other words, these Transjordanian villagers formerly ruled by Sihon became the tribe of Reuben, if they were not already constituted as such in Sihon's time. Interestingly, later biblical genealogies accord to Reuben the status of firstborn of Jacob Israel, consistent with the tradition that the Israelite Federation began here with this Transjordan tribe. So he's saying, there's a possibility that maybe this group of people, these villages, already call themselves Reuben or Reubenites or whatever. Or maybe they were just given the name after they joined themselves to Israel. But Professor Mendenhall is saying maybe it's a possibility that the reason that this was the first area where they established this faith of Yahweh, and so this would have been the first tribe, and so therefore that's why Reuben, in the narrative of the sons of Israel, he was given this status as the firstborn tribe. Maybe this is how these tribes came about, as this faith of Yahweh was established in a region, that the people in that region just became known as a new tribe. And eventually there were 12 regions or 12 tribes. And that's how this story, the origin of this story of the 12 tribes and the 12 sons of Jacob. So this is one theory. It doesn't mean that this is absolutely the way it happened. Soon thereafter, another warlord, the semi-legendary Og of northern Transjordan, mustered his warriors to pacify these politically unclaimed Reubenite villages to his south. Like Sihon, he was probably a recent immigrant from the north whose armed gang had taken control of the villages of Bashan. Og's warriors were routed at Edrei, and his political support collapsed. Like Sihon, he perished as his regime crumbled. Vast portions of village farmland and steppe-land in Transjordan were now unpatrolled and unclaimed by any political organizations, no longer appearing on any kingdom's tax rolls. Curiously, Deuteronomy 29 records a covenant being made here in the land of Moab. This serves no apparent literary purpose in the narrative and must have been mentioned because the tradition preserved historical memory of such a covenant actually being made there at the time. Historically speaking, a covenant would be necessary for a large segment of the Transjordan population to be formally incorporated into the community of Yahweh. This population comprised villages belonging to the tribes and clans of Reuben, Gad, Machir, and Gilead. A foundation was beginning to form. a federation was beginning to form. And there's a note in the book here that says, the book of Judges shows that there was always some new warlord eager to impose his control over these Yahwist villages in the Transjordan. The tribal structure there proved to be especially fragile, unable to withstand these warlords for very long. Within a century or so, Moabite regime has successfully gained political control over the Reubenite villages. This 9th century inscription of Mesha, king of Moab, implies that some people within his domain continued to identify themselves as Israelites. And so then in the book there's a photo of the stela, but I don't have it in the presentation. So the point is, like, this is a theory. This is one working theory of how the kingdom was established historically in Transjordan. Stage 2 is Palestine. The Bible also provides numerous clues that many of these Transjordan people had close social ties with people further west in Palestine, who had likewise fallen victim to military gangs roaming the hill country. In addition, the various Philistine regimes on the coast were establishing their own political confederation to consolidate their hold on the southern coastal plain. The news of the demise of the Transjordan regimes would have been welcomed by the Palestinian villages of the hill country, some of whom probably had kinsmen in Transjordan. But the military warlords of the hill country would have received the news with mounting concern. For example, when the people of Gibeon, who had remained non-Yahwist, made a covenant with the new Yahwist federation, they were attacked by a coalition of Amorite regimes operating out of the towns of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Elgon, presumably to punish Gibeon for making peace with these Apiru Hebrews, apparently assisted by Yahwist volunteers from Transjordan. And some kind of meteorological miracle, the Gibeonite managed to defeat the troops dispatched by this coalition. The nature and extent of the Yahwist appropriation of hill country Palestine is indicated by Joshua 12, a list of conquered kings, including the hill country warlords based in Tisra, Tapua, Hepher, and Aphek. Each of them, along with a couple dozen soldiers armed with swords and spears, probably controlled the nearby villages, but several hundred local villagers, emboldened by the tide of events and armed with stones, clubs, and mattocks, could have routed these soldiers without any major military planning or organization. The whole central hill country would then be unclaimed by any political organization. According to this historical reconstruction, this is all that these so-called wars actually involved. On the other hand, some of the regimes on the lowland plains of Palestine, those controlled by the Philistine coalition, had sufficiently strong grip on the villages there that they simply could not be taken. According to Joshua 24, a late text, these events culminated in yet another covenant being made. Joshua summoned representatives of the hill country tribes to Shechem, where he told them, "Now if you are unwilling to serve Yahweh, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve Yahweh." There was no metaphysical inquiry about their belief in God. It was an utterly practical question, asking people formally to declare which value system they were going to embrace. One option was to embrace the former system of political domination, which lay around them in ruins, a system legitimized ideologically by the worship of Baal and the concomitant devotion to political power. There was always the possibility that this system, like the mythological Baal himself, could be revived and made operational again, even after it was presumed dead. The other option was to embrace the religious controls of the Yahwist covenant, with his vision of a community based on conscientious regard of certain ethical obligations, a system defined simply as fearing and serving Yahweh. Joshua warned these people that it was not easy to serve Yahweh, to build real and lasting community on little more than voluntary compliance with a fundamental ethic. Indeed, it is always difficult, but it is also always necessary. Even communities held together by political forces cannot survive the failure of the governed to agree to the substance of ethical conduct and voluntarily comply with it. The hill country population chose to embrace the Yahwist ethic. In the metaphor of the Bible, drawn from the familiar words of late Bronze Age international treaties, Yahweh had become their king or their lord. This new community of Yahwists, eventually named Israel, probably after one of its recently incorporated population groups, probably the same one mentioned a generation earlier by Merifta. In a relatively short time, the community of Yahweh worshippers had grown from several hundred to 250,000 people. All these villagers in Palestine and Transjordan would eventually attach their own distinctive tribal traditions to the story they had heard about the Epirus slaves who had been delivered out of bondage in Egypt years earlier. Thus, the experiences of the formative period became part of the experience of everyone in the community, a concept still retained in the Jewish Passover Seder. So the concept in the Jewish Passover Seder he's talking about is that when you're doing the Passover, it says to imagine as if you yourself had just come out of Egypt, like you were part of the original group at Mount Sinai. The kings of antiquity almost always ruled by force or conquest. Even the son who succeeded to the throne of his father required the support of the military and had to be prepared to murder sibling rivals. See, for example, the biblical story of Solomon's ascension to the throne in 1 Kings 1 and 2. The king became king through his superior ability to intimidate and kill others. Overcoming all rivals was what established him as king, providing objective evidence that he had indeed become chosen by the gods. By contrast, the rule of Yahweh was founded on the voluntary acceptance of the covenant. Whether it was adopted there, Yahweh was empowered to rule, creating a community or fellowship where none had existed before. The oldest biblical sources say nothing at all about Israel being Yahweh's chosen people. Instead, as in Exodus 15 and Deuteronomy 32, they refer to it as Yahweh's created people. The rule of God over human beings was not the product of military force, but arose in response to Israel's deliverance from those who valued and relied on such force. Given the number of well-armed warrior gangs roaming the countryside of Palestine and Transjordan, violence was a fact in the early Iron Age. Consequently, it was important to distinguish between violence that was truly holy and thus legitimate exercise of Yahweh's sovereignty and violence that was not. War became holy when it was the action of the deity. Most of us are understandably uncomfortable with the concept of holy war, which has been distorted through the ages by ambitious politicians eager to exploit religion in pursuit of some allegedly national interest. Our discomfort is intensified because Joshua 1 through 11 misrepresents the holy war against the hill country warlords as fairly typical imperialistic military invasion. So essentially you see a certain level of symmetry or agreement between Simon Peter's historical vision of Israel and what Professor Mendenhall is proposing here. A historical reading of the biblical tradition suggests that early Israelite holy war was entirely defensive, in other words, fought within its own home territory, the Holy Land. This criterion distinguished a holy war from those waged by warrior politicians intent on territorial expansion. The tribal federation of Israel arose as villagers merely sought to defend their homes and livelihoods from ruthless warrior gangs. And so this brings us to the end of chapter 3. And so next time we'll be looking at chapter 4, where it discusses the establishment of the monarchy and the second adaptive period, where now this Sinai covenant had to be reimagined and reinterpreted and altered to give legitimacy to this new monarchy that rose up. So I pray that this has been a blessing to you. It's given you a few things to think about and maybe reimagine or a new understanding of what the actual history was, as opposed to what we've been given in the book of Joshua. So thank you for listening. Shalom.